This episode of 10 years of C64 gaming will be the first one to be split into 3 smaller videos rather than being a single over an hour-long behemoth. For 2 reasons really. For one, it will allow me to release videos more often and not have you wait few weeks between the episodes. And for 2, it will less likely explode my editing PC that's on its last legs. I may also, after dropping all 3, release them as a singular additional video on my channel for those who prefer those longer ones. So, best of both worlds? Anyway, let's get on with it. On January 4th, Commodore introduced C128, which could also work in a mod that was fully compatible with C64. Steve Jobs quit Apple on September 16, and while they thought that they'd do just fine, he came back years later to save the company from the brink of an end. You can dislike the man if you will, but he was a visionary. On December 8th, New York Times published an article on how no average user will ever want to own a laptop, which is just hilarious today. Microsoft and IBM began working on a joint OS going by the name of OS2. We know how it ended up today, but back then it was supposed to be something big. Also in 1985, Atari introduced its new 8-bit microcomputers, namely 65, 130 and 260 lines, and a 16-bit 520 ST. Nintendo released NES and Super Mario Bros, and Intel introduced 386 CPU. Amiga premiered its A1000 model, which while incredibly impressive, was too expensive and not very successful until the release of A500 2 years later. While all this news seemed to be touching many areas and subjects, it's clear that 1985 was a breakthrough year for computing. But let's see how it was for C64 gaming. ACE, Air Combat Emulator, is a combat flight simulation where you're a lone fighter pilot operating from one of 3 remaining Allied bases against enemy invasion. Each base holds one of the futuristic Mark 2.1 AW-80 crafts, and you're the only one who can contain these beasts and use them against overwhelming enemy forces. You'll be flying numerous missions and fighting against all land, naval and air targets. The game can be played in 9 levels of difficulty during summer or winter seasons and day or at night. And such a vast choice before the game even starts was definitely not a standard back then. ACE also uses synthesis to announce dangers approaching in the form of enemy planes or missiles. If during the mission you're on the verge of running out of fuel, you have to either come back to your base or perform an aerial refueling, which will require meeting with a refueling craft at specified coordinates, which in itself is an interesting experience, at least in simulation as old as ACE. I'm not very proficient at simulation games, but I know a good one when I see it, and ACE is really decent. Alice in Wonderland is an adventure game based upon the 2 Alice books by Lewis Carroll, very similar to year prior's Below the Root. In fact, it uses the same engine as Below the Root, with a difference being that the earlier game put more emphasis on role-playing, while Alice is more about puzzle solving. And these can come in many varieties. Some are your classical adventure genre inventory puzzles, others require solving riddles, and there are also these that demand figuring out how to get somewhere that's seemingly impossible to get to. The game, however, is not an adaptation of the books, but more of a story inspired by them. All in all, time is incredibly important in Alice, and you have to complete the game before the Red King awakes, so keeping an eye on it is crucial. Interestingly enough, in conversations, Alice does not pick words but rather emotions, which is an unexpected but fresh touch. If you like adventure games, especially those earlier ones, Alice in Wonderland is not one to miss. Duel is a post-apocalyptic top-down view game taking place in futuristic version of USA, where gangs and vigilantes run the wasteland in their armored and heavily armed cars. It's a mixture of light role-playing with driving and action-based combat, and it's based on a classic board game, Car Wars. You're an average Joe and you must earn enough money to own a car and then support yourself performing courier missions around the country. You're not locked on a certain pre-assigned path and can freely traverse the world however you please. So you'll be able to visit different cities, explore the highways, take part in car arena battles, which can be quite profitable in fact, salvage car parts from wrecks, take on gangs in the wilderness, and more. You'll be able to build and customize vehicles, choosing different bodies and chassis of the cars, and equipping them with guns, rockets, mine layers, oil slick, smoke screen generators, and others. And while there is an overarching story that unfolds after completing certain number of courier missions, you don't have to follow it, and can just live your futuristic wasteland life of a budget Mad Max. Bard's Tale along the Ultima series of games is one of the forefathers of modern RPGs. The town of Scarabrae has been attacked by the evil wizard Magnar, and he turned most of the inhabitants into his army of monsters, and you have to find Magnar and dispose of him video game style, so permanently in an epic battle culminating hours-long gameplay. Your party can consist of up to 6 adventurers, 3 of which stand in the front line and can engage in melee combat, while the back 3 use spells, items and bard chants. There can be an additional 7th character in your party temporarily, and that's either a conjured creature or a character you've met on your travels. The game world is viewed through a small window with simple 3D graphics during traversal, and the rest of the screen is used for character stats and for status display and interaction. Other than the title screen and bard chants, there's no sound or music in the game. Which is a waste, but I suppose they had to fit in quite a lot of content, so if something had to go, it was the sound. Right from the get-go, it's obvious why Bard's Tale was so popular. It was easy to get into and deep when you finally started playing. It's a real treat to all fans of the genre. World Championship Boxing, aka Star Rank Boxing, unlike most games depicting the sport, is not an arcade romp, but a simulation. At the beginning of the game you create your boxer with the aim of defeating the world champion, Barry McGuigan. So you have to steadily climb the ladder of the world ranking list. You can choose between 2 players directly above you and 1 below in the ranking. Between fights you get to train your boxer, and while in many games it only influences the stats, in World Championship Boxing you can actually feel the improvements while playing. You get money for wins, but in reality it's irrelevant as your ultimate goal is to become the next champion, not to amass wealth. While graphics and sounds are nothing to write home about, they do justice to represent what's happening on the screen, and you can actually sort of feel the feedback of each hit. So you could say that their design is appropriate. Anyway, the game features 2 covers and 6 kinds of hits. The movement on the ring is indirect, meaning as you attack your fighter will move forward, and as you cover he will back out. If you like the sport and have a soft spot for C64, it's a good one, check it out. Beachhead 2 is a successor to the first game and follows the similar formula of chaining smaller minigames into one bigger overarching story. This time the dictator from the first game, going by the name of the Dragon, seeks revenge against the Allied forces by kidnapping hostages and bringing them to his island fortress. Well, when he kidnaps them, they're not hostages yet, just your everyday VIPs that are worth saving. Apparently, as it's not shown anywhere. And they become hostages when they're in said captivity. Oh, and the game can be played in 2-player multiplayer, where one person controls the allies and the other the dictator. Anyway, the first minigame, or sequence if you will, is called the attack, and you have to march your soldiers forwards hiding behind the walls, and dictator has to shoot at those soldiers. Second is rescue, where allies use machine gun to defend the hostages as they cross the open courtyard. And dictator deploys tanks, trucks, trapdoors and soldiers on top of a wall to stop them. Only one of them can be on screen at once, so it's worth keeping in mind. Third is called escape. Allied commander places hostages on copters and then controls those copters, avoiding attacks. Dictator chooses automated defenses and then aims his tanks at helicopters. The final sequence, aptly named Battle, is a showdown between the Allied commander and the dictator, where they throw knives at each other until only one is left standing. If you like the first Beachhead, second's 2-player mode is a fun addition and you should enjoy it as well. While Boulder Dash 2 Rockford's Revenge is a follow-up to one of the most important games of the whole 8-bit era, it will probably be the shortest preview in this video. Why, you may wonder? Well, cause there's not much to talk about here really. It's the same puzzle game we've spoke about in the previous video, mechanically unchanged from the original. So you still have to collect diamonds, and after securing a certain amount you need to get to the exit. And all the while making sure that you don't die and don't block your way out. The main difference here is use of new engine that fixed some issues of the original and added slime and growing blocks as the new elements to the gameplay. Other than that, it's a 16 level strong second Boulder Dash that's as fun and demanding as the first one was. If you like the original, you'll most likely like this one too. Bounty Bob Strikes Back is a puzzle action platformer where you have to claim all of the 25 levels in their entirety. You do so by walking on platforms that light up when stepped on. When you highlight every single one in each level, you move to the next. Some are easier to get, others not so much, so you'll be jumping a lot using ladders, slides, suction tubes, cannons and transporters to name a few, while avoiding dangerous enemy creatures. They kill you on touch, so they have to be jumped over or killed via use of special food items scattered around each level. After consuming such food, you can remove the enemies for a short time by just walking into them. First levels are pretty straightforward and easy to complete. The further you go to, however, you'll need to plan your strategy, as some may have just a solution or two for completion. Oh, and all that within preset time limit. Bounty Bob is a sequel to Miner 49er that sadly did not make the cut to one of the earlier videos in the series. Oh well, such is life. Let me start by highlighting that even though I love strategy games, I hate Risk. With passion. I don't know why, but I just despise it and its gameplay, and consider it below what is playable and what could be considered a strategy. Now, I know that I'm wrong, so don't worry, I'm aware that I am mistaken, as most of you can't be wrong in loving it. It's just me and my issue with it. Anyway, Colonial Conquest I actually kinda low-key am able to enjoy if there are other players involved. And it's basically Risk on steroids. It takes place between 19th and 20th century and allows you and up to 5 buddies to pick one of 6 major powers of the time, so England, Germany, France, United States, Japan and Russia. You control both land and naval forces of your chosen country, and your goal is to take as much land as possible and become the biggest superpower that there is. And since there's over 120 minor nations, the game can take a while to complete. Each nation's units have their own attack and defense values as well as different cost. For instance, Russia pays a third of what England does for the ground units, but British units are much stronger. So playing with each nation is a bit different and may require adjusting your strategies. A lot can be said about Commando, and I will, but what I'd like to start here with is Rob Hubbard's iconic tune that you're hearing in the background now. Usually I would begin with gameplay footage, but this single tune alone is worth those few seconds to fully appreciate what the men and the C64 were capable of. It's a classic. Now, with that out of the way, what is Commando? You should know if you're watching this video, but since you may just be curious and not a C64 passionate, I'll try to explain the best I can. It's a port from arcades and it's vertically scrolling shoot 'em up where you're controlling a lone soldier who's pitted against an overwhelming force of enemy units and he alone has to defeat them all. To do that, you have 3 things at your disposal: your trusty M60 machine gun, 6 grenades, and most of all, your complete ignorance of your odds of survival. Which are a number solo, I'm not sure there's a name for it. And enemies? They don't F around either. And they go at you at full force. Dynamite, mines, grenades, the explosions are coming from all sides and have to be avoided. So at times it seems like you're dancing between those and enemy bullets. That said, and also quite fortunately for you, it seems that enemy units were trained by the same people who trained stormtroopers. So while they shoot at you and toss grenades left and right, their accuracy is questionable at best. And most deaths will be results from you walking straight into a bullet. So it's a difficult game, but mainly because of all the chaos everywhere rather than proficiency of enemy forces. Commando is an iconic title mainly for its music, but it's pretty fun in its own right, even if nowhere near the best shooter on the system. One thing I believe could be improved is the length of the game. Arcade Original had 8 levels and C64 Sport has only 3. So yeah, that's pretty mid, given most of conversions from the arcades on C64 were usually quite feature-rich. Doriath is an action-adventure game in which you lead on the lore master who found an ancient scroll written ages ago by Fianna, beloved of the Lord of Time. It speaks about mythical coronet of Arian, which grants immortality, and its location in the depths of Doriath. To complete the game you must gain 100% wisdom and find 8 pieces of scroll of Warsley to reveal the exact location and way of recovering the coronet. Now, that was a lot of names that are nothing but a nightmare to pronounce, at least to me. To increase your wisdom you must open chests that are spread around the dungeons. They may contain pieces of the scroll that you need or one of various other helpful items like potions and spells that can be used to kill monsters. If you don't have a scroll and corresponding amulet to destroy a particular monster, it needs to be avoided as his touch will decrease your stamina, and if it goes below 2%, it's game over. Some obstacles can reduce stamina too, and there are objects that require use of colored keys to pass. Doriath is an interesting exploration game that uses odd jump/float mechanic that requires a minute to get used to. It's a fun title nonetheless, and I recommend it to any and all fans of epic adventures. The Duel is a 2-player arcade versus shooter, and yes, 2-player only, not up to 2 players. In essence, it's every Western fan's wet dream. You and a buddy are 2 cowboys, and you're pitted against each other in a deadly shootout duel. Each of you has 5 bullets in your Colts, and only your keen eye, fast hands and dexterity to save you. So whomever is faster, more accurate will walk. And it's the end of the road for the other. Simple as that. And while the Duel is basic in its design, it's hella fun, and will no doubt prove to be a highlight of your gaming sessions if you have a friend or friends to play C64 games with. One thing I never understood was why the cowboys were purple. Perhaps it's amount of alcohol traveling in their veins, perhaps constipation or fear, but I never got an answer. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I've never played nearly enough Elite to ever fall in love with it. But it doesn't mean I don't recognize its significance in gaming history. And I've played Frontier to death, first on Amiga and then on PC, and Elite Dangerous, but that's a completely different subject for a completely different video. Perhaps comparison of all 3 and the first encounters. Perhaps. Coming back to the subject at hand, so Elite, what Ian Bell and David Braben did with this title is short of legendary, keeping in mind it originally released on an underpowered BBC Micro and then ported to everything else under the sun. Elite consisted of 8 galaxies with 256 planets each. Given the power of these early systems, they had to be procedurally generated, and Wikipedia calls Elite a space trading video game. For me, however, all titles in the series were more of a life in a space simulators, where you could trade various commodities, take military missions, fight enemy rogue ships, mine asteroids, get into bounty hunting, and in general live your space future life. Each of the planets available in the game has an orbiting around its space station. In later games, game world expanded beyond the scope of anyone's expectations, but that's something we'll not tackle in any of the C64's videos. For now, all I can say that Elite was a first game in a long-running series, and it was a very good one, limited only by the hardware it originally was designed for. Finders Keepers is a platform game with some maze sections. You play as Magic Knight and are sent by the king to find a special present for his daughter, the princess, in the castle of Spriteland. The castle is made up of two kinds of areas, flick scrolling rooms and two large scrolling mazes. An interesting aspect of the game is ability to pick up various objects all around the castle. They then can be sold for gold to various spread around the fortress traders. But there's a caveat to it though. They can be sold as they are, or even better, combined into a single more valuable item. For instance, a bar of lead and philosopher's stone have a certain value, but combined they create a bar of gold which is much more valuable. Finders Keepers is not a run-of-the-mill C64 game, it's quite unusual, so approach it only if you believe it may be something that you'd enjoy. The Fourth Protocol is based on a same title book by Frederick Forsyth, and it's an interactive fiction video game. It is composed out of 3 scenes in which you have to complete the game. First is the so-called NATO documents scene, in which you're in your office and you have to figure out who's leaking the secret documents, to whom and why. You can also assign watches to targets to learn more about them. Second section is the bomb. Not in its playability though, it's just the name of it. It's similar to the first with a difference of you being in the field on the trail of a nuclear device that has been smuggled into the country. You can also look around and examine objects here. And finally, the last one is SAS Assault, where you've discovered the bomb and using information gathered in previous 2 sections you have to try to defuse it. This part will require some text input on your side however. The Fourth Protocol is not your everyday C64 game, there's no action, no scrolling or shooting, it feels as if you were reading a book at parts. And you know what? It's fun because it's so different and unusual. Frankie Goes to Hollywood is not a game I will be able to explain well in such a short window I've got for each title, but I'll try. It's a side-scrolling action-adventure with some mysterious elements and even a murder to solve, all rolled into one crazy package. You start in Mundanesville, the most boring place in the world, and you have to complete over 60 tasks to become a full real person again, and unlock the passage to the so-called Pleasure Dome, which sounds way better than Mundanesville. You can collect and carry up to 8 items at once, and they have to be used in various situations to complete the aforementioned 60 tasks. The game also features corridors of power and networks of subterranean tunnels that lead to various places around Mundanesville and various mini-games. The Pleasure Dome also consists of many puzzles and mini-games, and I figured it's important to mention it here, as you'll need to complete them all to gather the required personality points to become the real person. Whatever that really means. Am I one? Or am I just a sophisticated AI created to fool YouTube viewers? We'll never know. Or at least not until I finally get a camera. Anyway, the minigames are very varied and represent different genres. All are quite weird though, and feel more like an acid dream than a game created based on traditional game design document. Even if for no other reason, it's worth to check out Frankie Goes to Hollywood to get to experience probably the most weird game you'll ever play. G.I. Joe, same as in cartoons and comic books, never ends. Never. If you do well, if you do bad, the game will carry on and you can play. Did you notice that many games in this video seem to be quite unusual for one reason or another? Perhaps 1985 was a special year indeed. Anyway, G.I. Joe is an arcade title that is surprisingly content-rich and pleasant in its graphical design. You can play in 1 or 2 player mode, where in 2 player, second person controls Cobra units. The game features a lot of characters, each with their own unique weapons. On the G.I. Joe side, they are Duke, Scarlet, Recondo, Torpedo, Snake Eyes, Roadblock, Spirit, Zap, Gung-Ho, Snowjob, Blowtorch and Stalker. And I gotta say, looking at those years later, they do seem to be named the same way porn actors in the 70s would. On the Cobra side, there are Destro, Baroness, Zartan, Firefly, Cobra Commander, Storm Shadow, Major Blood and Scrap Iron. The game shows you a map on which points of interest are shown with flashing ovals and diamonds. Ovals represent missions in vehicles and diamonds missions on foot. There are 4 vehicles available for the missions, and G.I. Joe needs to defeat 8 HISS tanks to win vehicle missions, while Cobra wins if G.I. Joe loses 3 of theirs. This is also when G.I. Joe can free captured units if there are any. Missions on foot usually see both sides put against each other in single-screen shootouts in various settings. G.I. Joe is definitely a title worth checking out, even if in the end it might not be everyone's cup of tea. In Ghettoblaster, you're rocking Rodney and you're employed by the Interdisc Record Company. You must collect batteries for your Ghettoblaster and then locate cassette tapes demos of dance music. While you play those cassettes, people around you dance to the beat coming off your boombox. You know, how they randomly did in the 80s. Only not really. Anyway, you must deliver those tapes to Interdisc, getting there through the large open city that's a maze of streets, alleyways and cul-de-sacs. All the way avoiding theft-on walkers, gangsters of groove, psycho killers and cops. Or bobbies I should say really, as the game takes place in London. Interesting fact, Ghettoblaster was inspired by real-life Rasta and his Ghettoblaster at Battersea Park in London. Oh, and all the streets are named after the famous music tracks. So yeah, that's Ghettoblaster, aka Street Beat. The Goonies is based on Steven Spielberg's movie of the same title, in which motley crew of suburban kids from a small town in Oregon must save their homes from foreclosure. And all that by finding a treasure map leading to an old pirate ship in a cavern that's filled with treasures. All the while maneuvering around and avoiding the Italian criminal family of fratellis. The game is built out of 8 entirely different single-screen levels based on the scenes from the movie, and loosely following its plot. In levels 1 through 7 you must make sure that both Goonies get to the exit, which may require a bit of gymnastics and solving very simple puzzles, while avoiding the fratellis and other environmental dangers. In the last level, both Goonies need to get to the treasure. While it may sound basic and boring, the game is actually fantastic and really fun. Especially that it can be enjoyed in 2-player mode when each of the players controls another Goonie, rather than one person having to switch between the two. The Great American Cross-Country Road Race, most likely the longest titled game on C64, is an expanded for the capabilities of modern at the time systems port of an earlier racer, Enduro. You're a race driver, duh, racing across United States while passing through some of its major cities. The game features day and night cycle, different weather conditions, limited fuel and road obstacles. You do have to keep an eye on highway patrols too, cause they can be a pain as well. You get to pick your own route while racing, and every available route has its own scoreboard for the top 10 fastest times. TGA-CCRR, wow, that sounds bad abbreviated. Anyway, TGA-CCRR is a fun checkpoint racer where you race against the time rather than other opponents, which is fine, and I enjoy these types of driving games a lot actually, as they are good to compete against yourself when there's no one around to compete with. This concludes first out of 3 episodes of 10 years of C64 gaming for 1985. And you can expect the next one very soon. If you like the video, you know what to do. If you have any comments, good or bad, hit me up below. If you feel like helping me make the channel better, I'd appreciate Patreon sub or YouTube membership. But if you don't want to or can't do those, likes and subscribes are great too. So, believe it or not, but the second episode will have as good if not better games. Make sure to come back to check it out in just few short days. Peace.